South Carolina, they tell their members who are planning to organize against a Klan rally and say, go home, don't do that. But certainly then the workers who are looking for a real alternative don't find one in Operation Dixie either.
Are you on? Which side are you on?
Fragile Juggernaut is a new podcast from Haymarket Books about the rise and fall of the CIO and everything in between. And there's another CIO podcast by Jacobin called Organize the Unorganized. It's a very similar project, different approaches and maybe different conclusions. I don't know. I think the Fragile Juggernaut has not concluded yet, so we're going to have to see what their conclusions are. But Ben Mabie and Tim Barker are part of what they're calling their organizing committee. And so basically like every person, and it's like 12 maybe, I don't know, it's a bunch of people, and they're each doing their own episodes on different facets of the era of the CIO, before, during, and after. And so Ben Mabie and Tim Barker are our guests on the program, part of the organizing committee, joining us today on the Valley Labor Report. Tim and Ben, welcome to the program. Thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you guys. Thanks for listening and thanks for having us on. We're really excited to chat with you.
Yeah, great to be here.
Great to have y'all. So I have not listened to the most recent episode, unfortunately. I wanted to do it yesterday and I got caught up with work and other prep for the show. So maybe you can fill us in on that. But I've listened to everything else, and like Adam said, it's really good. Highly encourage people to listen to it, and I will be listening to the most recent episode at some point. But before we talk about that, Ben and Tim, can y'all tell us about your background and what brought you to wanting to do a podcast about the CIO? Ben, we can start with you.
Well, that's great. I come from a union family, electricians and teachers. My mom was on strike just a couple of years ago in the San Francisco Bay Area, and one of the longest teacher strikes of that teacher strike wave that was kind of spreading across K-12 education during the Trump years, and I think continues to kind of roll on today. I myself was able to join the labor movement when I organized my small shop back in 2019, 2020. We went on to bargain a contract, and I've been really involved in the labor movement over the last couple of years right now, especially with New York Times tech workers at New York Times Tech who are bargaining their first contract, and hopefully will be a kind of lasting beachhead in the tech industry. But for me, someone has the family history, has been involved in politics, involved in the labor movement. I kept finding myself thinking back to this period, sometimes nostalgically, sometimes wishing we were back in one of these kind of huge upsurges of working class politics. And when we see the kind of green shoots of the success of the UAW, the success of rank and file reformers, the success of organizing service worker shops, I wanted to say, what was it like the last time we were in one of these moments? What were some of the strategic dilemmas that confronted organizers then? How is that different from the moment we're in now? And I realized I needed to be a more serious student of this history and of this moment. And, the organizing committee, it's a big crew, but it's really smart people, and they've been a great guide to kind of get back into this earlier moment when so much seemed possible and on the table for the labor movement.
What about you, Tim?
Yeah, so I also come from a union family, at least as much as that's possible, growing up in Central Florida where there aren't a lot of unions. But I spent a lot of time growing up with my mom's parents who are from New York and had been part of the East Coast Longshore Union and the Teachers Union, respectively. Interestingly, neither one of those is a CIO union, but I really got a sense, really from my grandparents, of just the whole overall what we're calling the age of the CIO, right? Something that didn't just limit itself to people who belonged to one of these unions, but was a whole, thing with demonstrations and concerts and, night school type things. And I think largely through spending so much time with my grandparents, I ended up becoming a historian. I went to graduate school for history, where I also became part of organizing UAW local at my graduate school, actually with a comrade named Brandon Mancia, who I think you guys might have heard of on here.
Sounds familiar.
And so my approach to the podcast is sort of coming out of academic history and wanting to share this history with a much bigger audience, because whenever I've had the chance to talk about this or teach this in a labor school, I find that people are really hungry to learn about this, to talk about it, to connect their experiences with what historians have to say. So I see the podcast as a way of trying to sort of bridge these different audiences.
And so what I'm hearing basically, and you're wanting to kind of analyze the lessons of the CIO period and what we can learn today. And so basically, if all union members listened to your podcast, we would be able to replicate and do more than what the CIO did, because we'll have learned the lessons and be able to learn from the mistakes. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I mean, that's the hope. There's, it's hard to replicate that moment. There's so much which is different now than then. And there's so much which is out of our hands in the labor movement too. We could be rank and file members. I'm sure many of your listeners are. We might be leading our locals, but we do not control the purse strings of some of the larger unions. And it's, one of the striking things about the CIO is that it combined both mass rank and file initiative along with a hell of a lot of financial resources committed towards, organizing the unorganized. And that second bit is one thing we're probably not going to get to the bottom of or be able to control here from this radio show.
Right. Well, that's why everybody, that includes the leaders, they've got to listen to the podcast too. And then, once we get all of the union presidents on board, then that's when we're going to be able to, all the presidents and all the members, and then we'll be able to do it again. So, let's just give us a super, kind of 30,000 foot overview of the CIO, and why that's important. Why is that a period that we should, as union members, be interested in learning about and learning the lessons of, and the mistakes from that period and that movement and that organization. So just the kind of 30,000 foot overview of the CIO and the age of the CIO and why we should be interested in that. And Ben,
do you want me to start, or do you want to? You
go ahead, Ben, and I'll jump in if I have something to add.
So, I mean, the big thing to think about is that, the CIO starts in 1935, but this idea of the industrial union, of bringing together all of the workers in one workplace or industry, regardless of your skill, regardless of the particular job you might do, but also without exclusions along the lines of race or gender or immigration status or religion, which was actually a big one in the earlier history of the American working class. This was a kind of torch that was carried for many decades throughout the workers' movement, often especially kind of lit up after moments when earlier strikes or struggles were defeated. So many strikes in railroads, in mining, in textile, they were often cut off or found themselves limited because they were only working from a smaller subsection of organizers. You might have people that had a particular skill or craft in a much larger corporate structure, but they would have their own separate organizations. And this inability to kind of build a movement which worked across those existing segregations and divisions lit up the idea and made people quite attracted to the idea of an industrial organization. People talked about it almost as much, perhaps even more, than they talked about the need to build their own independent labor party. So different groups over the kind of years leading up to the 1930s, like the international workers of the industrial workers of the world, the mine workers, they all kind of try these experiments to organize people on industrial lines, but it's not really until the 1930s where that breaks out. And so one of the important parts of this moment is you see a range of, out of the Great Depression, a range of really confident, strident, working class kind of strikes in textiles, in auto, in Teamsters and trucking, among sailors and longshoremen, and they put this idea of industrial organization back on the agenda. By the time the CIO comes around in 1935, they give that a durable organizational and institutional structure, and go on to kind of make conquests in steel, in auto, and a range of other industries, including white-collar workplaces, culture workers, and Hollywood. And what's striking about the CIO from, like the kind of 10,000-foot view is what it accomplishes for its members. Its success was partial. That's one of the things we want to talk about. It's not a story of only unalloyed victory. It's a story just as often of defeat and the kind of limits and brakes that were put on working class politics and organization. But they achieved quite a bit in terms of economic security for their members, in terms of dignity on the job. They conquered and defeated undemocratic company towns. They breathed new civic and democratic life in a lot of parts of America that previously hadn't seen it. And it also put on the agenda an idea of real egalitarianism amongst workers. American workers have long been divided along, again, axes of race, of immigration, of religion, of geography and sector, around gender. And the CIO, its standout through at least most of and the most important moments of its history is one of unity, and one of kind of a shared, it really did bring into American political life a range of different groups that were previously excluded from it. I don't know if Tim, if there's anything else you want to
Yeah,
add.
I mean, that's all really amazing. I think, you can sort of underline a lot of that by trying to think about it, what the CIO meant from the perspective of capitalists and business, and the state. And so the situation there is, in 1929, it's not that there are no unions. In fact, actually, like private sector union density is probably a little higher than it was now. But it's really in construction, it's in the railway brotherhoods, the most important industries in the country from the perspective of business, like steel, auto, rubber. These are completely union-free places. You can't work in these industries if you belong to a union. And that's not just a sort of natural condition. That's something that's been, built assiduously by employers in the state over a course of decades. And then within the course of less than a decade, that all changes. And the CIO sort of astonishingly quickly has organized almost all of these central industries, right? By the time World War II comes around, they've organized, the entire steel industry, the entire auto industry, and most of the rest of the mass production industries that are at the center of the American economy at this time. And so that happening so quickly gives them I mean, the leaders of the CIO, but also the workers in the CIO, who are workplace activists, but also voters. It gives them a real sense of power and a reality of power at a moment during the Great Depression when a lot of the basic coordinates of American politics and society are up for grabs, right? Everyone knows the system isn't working in the 1930s. The only question is how it's going to be put back together. And at that moment of crisis, working people come to have a real sense of their capacity, both in the workplace and in politics, which lets them at least have a voice in the agenda, for a period. I think we're going to end the show around 1955, by which time I think you could say a lot of that potential was had spent itself. But from 1930 to 1955 is a long time for workers to really have a voice in setting the agenda of the whole country.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, absolutely, because it's a lot different from today. I think that just in the last 2 or 3 years, we're seeing a situation where unions are, being considered in sort of political decisions as they're being made, but certainly not anything like the power that they had during the CIO period. And one of the big asterisks around the CIO's success in organizing these major industries and the American economy and having so much power is the South. And there was a big push to try to remedy that, to try to kind of maybe fulfill the promise of the CIO by organizing the South through Operation Dixie. That I can't remember where I saw this, but the popular imagination is of Operation Dixie as a huge kind of last-ditch gambit to organize the South with a lot of, resources behind it and a lot of interest in it. But that actually, if you analyze the expenditures of Operation Dixie compared to other attempts by other unions to organize Southern industries, it was smaller and really just kind of marked the end of concerted attempts to organize in the South, really. And so that's kind of an interesting thing. But obviously, the fact remains that the South was largely unorganized. And so I'm interested, and y'all haven't gotten to talking about Operation Dixie yet in your podcast, but I'm interested in your thoughts on the failure of the labor movement to, in a big way, organize the South. And Tim, we can start with you for this one.
Yeah, sure. So Operation Dixie is definitely crucial, and maybe we can sort of work our way back to it. But one thing we really, I think, have learned in preparing for the show and I'm trying to share with our audience is that, the history of the CIO and the South starts earlier. It actually starts, at the very beginning before the CIO. So even really at the very beginning, 1929, there are these major strikes in the textile plants in the Piedmont in North Carolina. The famous struggle at Gastonia that we talk about a little bit. Then, of course, in the coal industry, things really start kicking off in the early 30s when things are really, really bad there. And that includes, Alabama, which has a history of industrial organization in mine and steel mills too. And then there's also an attempt in 1934 to have a general strike in the textile sector. And what's really interesting is this is actually our most recent episode, which people can listen to, is all about these big strikes in 1934. And there are strikes in San Francisco, in Toledo, in Minneapolis. But the biggest strike in terms of numbers is this textile strike, which is across the country, including the South. But unlike a lot of those other strikes in Western and Northern cities, the textile strike in the South is completely crushed. And that's an example of how, long before Operation Dixie, back in 1934, some of these organizations were already faltering. And I think faltering for some of the same reasons that you mentioned, actually, that the resources weren't put into it. There wasn't the same, there certainly weren't the kind of rank and file or left-wing sort of mid-level tier activists that you found in other places. And a lot of the people who ended up trying to lead the organization in the South for the CIO, both in Operation Dixie and in an earlier moment in the 30s, they weren't really attuned to what it would take to win in the South, right? But there were other people within the CIO orbit who had a better idea of what that would look like. And maybe Ben can speak to those visionaries a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, just to underline 2 points you said there, Tim, the South, we need to rewrite and redraw our mental map of what working class politics looks like in this country, which often castigates the South as a kind of modern part of the labor movement. To be sure, it's less organized than the rest of the country now. That's a huge drag on our politics across the country. But the South, again, in 1934, 500,000 workers are on strike, largely in textiles, largely concentrated in the South. Some of the most explosive strikes in railroads at the end of the 19th century happening in St. Louis, Missouri. It is in terms of coal, in terms of steel, there's a lot of the most important episodes and battles are taking place in the southern part of this country. And I think we need to appreciate that and draw on those kind of traditions today. But, Jacob, you also had it right. Operation Dixie, I mean, it's often kind of almost used as a synonym for the idea of organizing the South. It was maybe one of the more feeble efforts in the period of really trying to make serious inroads amongst Southern workers. They only ended up spending $350,000 on Operation Dixie. It's about $5 million today. Let's put that into perspective. The UAW just pledged $40 million that they're going to spend in the next year just to reorganize auto, not organize the entire region.
Wow.
That money, that $350,000 that they spent, that was less than in the 1930s they had spent exclusively to organize textiles or exclusively to organize steel in the South. So it was the last ditch effort, as you put it. That's totally correct. But it was a half-hearted effort from the jump, because Operation Dixie, unlike the most successful drives we see throughout the 1930s and 40s, kind of relied on a strategy. There was maybe like 2 or 3 big mistakes we can talk about. The first one is its decision about where to concentrate. At first, it decided to concentrate not in the big cities where there were the heavy industries, which had a lot of structural power and also had a lot of movement organizations around them. What we might call the associational power of being able to call on your allies for boycotts, supporting the picket line, supporting you when you're on strike to help put the brakes on the possibility of repression. They instead concentrated on the large textile mills. The large textile mills were often isolated from the big cities. They had less allies that they could call on. And textiles, what's kind of tricky about them is that they don't have the same kind of structural power that you have in a steel mill, in an auto factory. And why is that? Well, when you're in a textile mill, you're often operating one machine, producing one garment at a time. And so if 3 or 4 of you go on strike, 3 or 4 machines aren't operating, but the rest of the mill is. What's striking about the sit downs or the strikes that occur in heavy industries in a lot of cases is that you could have a small group of people in an organizing committee really produce a chokehold that could shut down not just your plant, but many of the other plants all arrayed along the value chain of producing a particular commodity. So small minorities could exercise tremendous structural power there that really just wasn't true in textile. When textile workers are often most successful at organizing, they're all around the world, whether they're talking about Korea or Russia, in Western Europe, the United States. It's when they're located in cities where they have those allies they can count on that they're most successful. So the South, they focused on maybe the wrong mills. Why did they focus on textile mills? Well, they wanted to avoid the question of race. The textile mills were traditionally overwhelmingly white workers. They were in these more isolated towns, right? They weren't in some of the larger cities. And they thought, okay, we can avoid some of the trickier questions about the legacy and afterlife of slavery if we focus on some of these whiter mills. It wasn't successful because race, even in these small white towns, was invoked to break the union organizing drives. It was the anti-Semitism ran rampant in terms of attacking CIO organizers. They even used that in the case when there were Jewish mill owners. They still used anti-Semitic attacks to try to demonize the CIO or demonize the kind of interracial alliances that characterized it at its most successful moments. There's a couple other things worth mentioning is that, in addition to the structural power, associational power, the absence of anti-racism, there was a lot of women that worked in the mills. In some cases, much as 45% of the workforce was women. But they hired virtually no women organizers. It was largely exclusively men, even though women were the natural leaders oftentimes on the shop floor of these places. And instead, the CIO tried to adopt a strategy that said, we're going to cozy up to Dixiecrat political bosses. We are going to try to assuage the mill owners that it's not that big. Unionization won't be that big of a threat. And they came out against civil rights bills. They came out against progressive legislation. They spoke out against the anti-lynching bill that was traveling through Congress in 46 and 47.
I mean, at one point in Birmingham, they even the sort of right wing of the CIO was willing to work with the Ku Klux Klan against rivals, especially communists within the Steelworkers Union.
That's right. In South Carolina, they tell their members who are planning to organize against a Klan rally in South Carolina, they demobilize them, tell them go home, don't do that. And so they develop a reputation of, again, being a kind of run-of-the-mill Dixiecrat kind of political outfit, which doesn't gain favor amongst the politicians anyway, but certainly then the workers who are looking for a real alternative don't find one in Operation Dixie either.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
So I am, trying, I think maybe kind of similar to y'all in a much smaller way, but similar to y'all in before you started on this podcast being interested in, and thinking that this knowledge is important and you want to understand it. And so I have been recently trying to do some of this reading myself. I haven't read much about Operation Dixie yet. I have just started reading The Southern Key, and already I'm seeing a lot of kind of similarities in some of the arguments that you're making, and you've gone maybe further into this area than I've gotten yet. But that is fascinating that not only did Operation Dixie, there was a rhetorical kind of sidestepping of the race question, which that's one thing to do that. And I say that interestingly enough because we just talked to Dan Letwin, author of Alabama Coal Miners, The Challenge of Interracial Unionism. And that is actually what the UMW did in the late 19th and early 20th century. They kind of, rhetorically sidestepped the race question. They were not, they weren't going out and doing a lot of the pro kind of integration, social equality stuff. But strategically, they were very much obviously, an interracial union insofar as you could be in times like 1901 in Alabama when the Constitution was being rewritten to disenfranchise black people. They still had black members and black leaders elected presidents, right? And so, that's a huge difference between what the UMW was doing. And this is, 1898, 1901, 1906. The UMW was doing, sure, they weren't perfect, right? You wouldn't be able to talk to somebody from the UMW at that time today and think they've got great, perfect politics. But it's a lot different to kind of rhetorically sidestep the question while strategically and tactically and in actuality being pretty interracial and pretty egalitarian. It's a whole different thing to strategically target places where you think that, we're not going to have to deal with this a lot. And then when you do have to deal with it, siding with the Ku Klux Klan.
Right.
That is wild.
It's baffling. It doesn't work. Right? It's a strategy which makes what should be your most natural constituency in Vanguard. When they polled workers, black workers, white workers across the South about their feelings of the CIO, I think it was 70-something% of white workers were in favor. 90% of black workers wanted to join a union. And yet Operation Dixie fails to attract them to the campaigns that they're organizing, most often because they are sending out all of the opposite political signals that you would want to send out, that your issues and your concerns, attacking the Jim Crow order, is not at all part of what the union is about. We're only narrowly going to talk about a couple of issues around wages, and maybe not even that. This is a long-standing problem for workers across the South, of leaders which want to avoid the race question, but also leaders which don't take the issues of textile workers seriously. Even when you have 500,000 largely white workers going on strike in 34 or right in the eve of the Great Depression or start of the Great Depression, one of the main things they want to talk about is called the stretch out, the speed up, the rate at which they have to crank out a lot of these goods. But that is an issue that oftentimes the main cast, bureaucrats in the AFL, don't want to touch at all with the 10-foot pole, and they want to narrowly concern issues around union recognition and around wage increases. And that's doubly true of issues around race and discrimination, and also gender and discrimination, gender harassment, which is rampant often, especially in these kind of mill towns. What's interesting, and I want to pass to Tim in a second, is that there are other routes that people took throughout the South. I mean, again, when radicals are kind of organizing some of the textile strikes in the early 20s after the AFL abandons it entirely and radicals have to step into the breach, they don't hide their politics. They say pretty openly about what they're about, what they think about capitalism. They also, even when it's a largely and overwhelmingly white workforce, champion the idea of interracial unity. And that is something a lot of the leaders in the Gastonia strikes or the Piedmont strikes take place in the early 20s. They become outstanding advocates for civil rights in the years ahead, which shows, I think, there's another path worth taking. It's not as if people's ideas about this can often be plastic, and they can be shown that unity can be the basis of advancing their own interests, that people can be won over to egalitarian ideas if you're willing to organize for them. I think it's one of the lessons of this story, and unfortunately not a lesson that the CIO leadership by the 1940s is really heeding.
Right. I'll pass it back to Tim in just a second, but just for it's absolutely racist. Adam put in our notes document that race is still an issue in the South, absolutely. And just for for what it's worth, a little bit of lore from the Valley Labor Report. David, the guy that I started the program with, his grandmother was actually. My recollection of his recollection, right? So now we're twice removed, but was that his grandmother was president of the local in Huntsville when they went on strike during the textile strike, and he's always kind of regretted not asking her more about that, because that would be kind of a fascinating thing. And so I'm not totally sure that she was the president as opposed to maybe a member or a leader, but I think that's my recollection of his recollection the last time we talked about that.
Well, there's a book about this called "We Were All Leaders," right? So maybe she was.
There you go.
I love that. Yeah, and I just wanted to jump in before we let you have the final word there, Tim, that what y'all were describing is so relevant today into our movement and the issues that we're grappling with, even though there are so many differences in terms of conditions, like, you described earlier. But, these questions of race and what is a union issue and where does the union step out and lead versus follow? Those are all questions we have to grapple with today. And it's questions that, our union leaders aren't always doing a great job with, just like they didn't then. And, I think some of the aftermath of Operation Dixie and things like that, we still deal with, right? There's still, you know, a bad taste in people's mouth in some instances, right? Where some folks in the Black community remember unions as being, you know, racist institutions, just for lack of a better word, right? I mean, that's out there. And, you know, some of that history is still impacting organizing today, right? And so it's not just the questions, but like also the aftermath there. But yeah, I wanted to let you jump back in, Tim, but that just really stuck with me.
Said.
Yeah, maybe just, you know, a last thought. You know, as listen to all you guys talk, you know, I want to say that it's not just in the South that Southerners are engaging in the CIO, right? There's also a huge migration during the Second World War of both white and Black Southerners into factories in the North and the West. And there's some of the same problems we're talking about with Operation Dixie actually happening there, right? Where by the time World War II comes around, the top CIO bureaucrats have a very kind of technocratic, anti-democratic view of the unions, so that even when some of these Southerners end up enrolled in unions because they're working in war plants, they still don't really feel like the unions belong to them or are theirs, right? And that can be true whether you're a white Appalachian or, you know, a Black Southerner working in a UAW plant where there are no Black shop stewards. And so, you know, that's just a way of saying that in the end, the question of the South and the CIO is not a Southern question. It becomes a national question. And as you said quite well, one we're still living with today.
Right. Well, and that's here's another lore thing. We've got a High Thurman was a Southerner that moved to Chicago and was part of the Rainbow Coalition. This is obviously a separate period, but you know, that dynamic of Southerners kind of being everywhere, you know, because of the migration is key in multiple periods and for multiple reasons. And so with, you know, talking about Operation Dixie and the 1934 strikes, including the textile strike, is you know, there are different periods, but there's a lot of interplay there. And so the most recent episode was about the 1934 strikes. And so talk to us about the dynamics of the strikes in 34, what made them unique, and, you know, what were the possibilities there that were not fully realized, and what were the implications of the realization or lack thereof for the age of the CIO and for, you know, labor in the South.
You know, the strikes in 34, they're some of the most heroic strikes you can imagine. Someone, a historian who wrote a great book, Workers on the Waterfront, said they almost seem like they're coming out of like an old proletarian novel from the 1930s, except their, you know, truth sometimes can be a little bit stranger than fiction. These were this is before the CIO, mind you, right? A year before the CIO actually gets its own institutional legs. So these are largely happening within kind of conservative craft unions in the AFL. But workers kind of take hold of what organizational resources they can find and produce like real general strikes that rock a number of kind of mid-sized industrial cities across the country and send a kind of green light to workers all over the United States that now is the time to be on the move. So we talk about three of them in these years. There's the Teamsters strike in Minneapolis. There is the Autolite strike in Toledo, Ohio. And then there's the West Coast waterfront strike, particularly concentrated in San Francisco. And there's maybe a couple of unique features to these strikes that are worth mentioning. First is that they often involve small groups of radical workers, at the time members of the Communist Party, members of the Trotskyist movement, members of other kind of dissident left-wing kind of offshoots that provide a kind of vantage point and alternative organizational infrastructure to popularize the idea of big transformative demands and provide an organizational infrastructure when the existing union leadership wants to pull the brakes on the strike. So that's one important feature you see across all of these strikes, this fascinating interaction between small groups of radicals and a much larger mass movement of workers, where the small groups of radicals can be a tribune for, can provide some direction to, but also provide the space for working class leadership to kind of emerge in the course of these fights. I think the other striking thing about 1934 is the kind of demands that they fought over. They were oftentimes fighting for union recognition. They were fighting for increased wages. In a place like San Francisco and the West Coast waterfront, they were also fighting for substantive transformations in the way that work felt and the way that people experienced work. They were fighting for the hiring hall. One of the big ways that sailors and longshoremen were disciplined was by kind of, the capacious control of a single kind of manager guy on the docks to decide whether or not you'd be hired for a job that day. You'd show up to work every Monday and you had no idea whether or not you'd be selected to the job. People were often kicking back upwards of 10, 20% of their wages in order to make sure that they were going to be hired. And so workers made, the small group of radicals helped popularize the demand that we should control the hiring hall. Unions and workers should determine in what fashion we distribute jobs so it happens on an equal playing field, so that we don't have to be subject to speed ups from the bosses.
Right.
And we can kind of have some control over work. And so those demands also, I think, are really important. Demands also about who controls the work process, and are you willing to kind of pursue those demands even outside the scope of a normal contract? Tim, I don't know if you have more you want to add there.
There's a lot, and Ben and the other co-hosts do a great job on that episode. I think another really interesting new innovation that they did in some of these strikes was to try to bring in the unemployed, right? Because if you think about trying to organize a union in the Depression is hard for a lot of reasons, in part because there's lots of people lined up outside without jobs who would like to have jobs. And up to this point, union leaders had basically treated the unemployed as, an enemy, a threat, a dangerous class. But in a lot of these places like Minneapolis and Toledo, through some of this organizing that happened earlier in the Depression when the bottom was really falling out, there were these unemployed councils and organizations of the unemployed. And the way that comes together in some of these strikes, it just shows you the kind of creativity that can come out of crazy moments like this. When there's a court injunction against workers picketing, they'll say, okay, we'll bring in the unemployed council to, surround the plant and actually have them help. And it's a really, I think a new and kind of like a, really brilliant stroke that shows you how some of these organizers were thinking and the difference a few people thinking along those lines could make to some of these struggles.
You mentioned...
Yeah, they're really trying to bring...
Oh, no, go ahead.
Please. I say in all these cases, they're really trying to bring in workers beyond the immediate plant. So they bring in workers, right? The unemployed workers as well, and they combine them with the other workers. And the general strikes oftentimes involve other unions supporting the strike and even backing it. And so even as their demands are often about one workplace or another, they're pushing back against repression. They're pushing back against the bringing of the National Guard into these towns. And they're trying to lay claim to a new social warrant that workers can and should be organized. And it's only through their own self-help that they're going to be able to set the agenda for the country at large. They can no longer wait for FDR or someone in DC to do it for them.
So you mentioned in there the importance of the leadership and participation of radical elements in the CIO or in then AFL unions. From in particular, I think the largest actor is the Communist Party, but there were other Trotskyist organizations that were influential in certain areas, and the participation of radicals in unions, whether they call themselves communists or socialists or anarchists or Trotskyists or whatever, has been, as I read history, an incredibly important feature of union success. When the labor movement is successful, it seems to me that there are a huge participation in the labor movement by radicals, and a lot of leadership are radicals themselves, or at least sympathetic to them, and so I'm interested. Could talk to me about your perception of the role of radicals in the age of the CIO, both the positive and the negative, because, the Communist Party and Communist Party members were purged from the CIO. And, I think the easy thing as people that are radicals or sympathetic to radicals today, the easy thing is to say, oh, that was a terrible decision, right? And I think probably on principle it was, but there were a lot of things that the communists did, that kind of made them lose favor with workers and made it easier for the anti-communist forces in the labor movement to expel them. So yeah, comment on that and the importance and presence of radicals in the movement writ large.
Tim, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right. I think, almost anyone looking at this history would have to agree that radicals and, particular Communist Party members were, almost indispensable to the organizing of the CIO. I think at the same time, almost everyone would agree that there are, very serious mistakes made, and that, there were things that the Communist Party did that undermined, their own interests and those of the CIO. The way that people talk about this a lot is in terms of the changing lines in the Communist Party, right? And of course, there's nothing wrong with having different tactics and strategies at different times. It's kind of what you would want from a political organization. But some of the turns were so abrupt, I think, that they did cause people to lose faith in the Communist Party as an organization devoted to, domestic class struggle as opposed to Soviet foreign policy. Right. And so the most famous example of that is the sort of changing position on World War II. Right. There's a period when the Communist Party is very anti-fascist, then a sort of turn towards opposing U.S. entry to World War II, and then a reverse turn towards supporting the war, which is so so fervent that then the communists, at least in the top leadership levels, become supporters of the no strike pledge. Right. And so even, from a sort of left-wing rank and file perspective, they're on the wrong side of that, leaving aside whatever you think about the Soviet Union. So I agree with all that. I think, we try to be balanced but still opinionated on the show, and I think part of that is to say that in each of these moments of different party lines, there are still interesting lessons to be learned, So I'll take an example. Like, it's very easy, I think, to think that the Soviet Union was, or the U.S. Communist Party was wrong, or it was not helpful for them to take this position of opposing U.S. entry into World War II. But they actually organized a lot of really important strikes during that period, which initially were thought of in a kind of conspiratorial way. They're organizing the aviation industry because they want to cripple the war effort. But as historians have really looked at that, they say that no, actually, aircraft workers were like really being underpaid and needed a union. And so maybe, if not always, for the right reasons, there's something to learn from all of these periods. Even though I think, as I would agree with you, that the Communist Party did itself no favors in many cases and did make it easier for its enemies to come in for the kill after the war.
We could talk about this for hours, and I guess thankfully we will on the podcast. But I think that like Tim nailed the basic dynamics. I think that like it's worth thinking about, why were radicals so important? Well, a couple of reasons. One is that you needed people to be quite dedicated. These were often deadly missions, organizing these plants and drives. Violence was endemic to efforts to respond to the labor movement all across the country. We talk about the South earlier, but California was the ACLU's most dangerous state by the start of 1934 in terms of the severity of labor repression. And that was after a number of immigrant workers were kind of really attacked and terrorized all across the kind of California, the valleys of California's agricultural industry. Radicals could provide a kind of element of determination, of a willingness to kind of go into these relatively dangerous situations. They often had pulled together resources like newspapers. Again, in the waterfront strike, it was an old communist newspaper, the Waterfront Worker, that ended up being the organ through which workers communicated with each other about their need for steadfastness, around the need for the demand around the hiring hall, about the importance of organizing along industrial rather than narrow craft lines. So these radical groups provided determination, they provided an infrastructure, but they also provided an idea that workers should have kind of unfettered power over the shape of their working days. And those that kind of idea often translated into ambitious demands, more ambitious demands than the labor movement can sometimes throw up. They could anticipate, something Alex Press talks about in her episode of 1934 when talking about the Dune brothers, these group of four Trotskyist brothers that helped lead a strike in Minneapolis. It's like it's the Iron Claw, but the 1930s version. It's pretty incredible. but they knew and helped inoculate workers against the almost certain reality of state repression that was going to come in the course of the strike. Repression often devastates strikes. The radicals could tell you, okay, we're steeled for this, we're prepared for this, and we know how we can fight back against it. And even that kind of work of inoculation could often make quite a big difference.
Well, I think that's great. All really important stuff. Really appreciate your time, Tim and Ben. The podcast is called Fragile Juggernaut. It is an original by Haymarket Books, the first, I think, original limited run podcast series. I guess we can close with Fragile Juggernaut. I think maybe the name makes intuitive sense, but why did you call it that?
It's the name of an opening chapter. There's not a lot of great books that tell the whole story of the CIO. One of the few efforts at putting one is together by a historian by the name of Ziegler, and he opens his intro, he titles it Fragile Juggernaut, which is the idea that there was this massive working class there's this massive moment when workers joined into their own organizations and were a juggernaut that reshaped American political life and the economy more in their image, more in their interest. But it was a fragile one that fell apart relatively soon after its kind of origin. So it's like, we don't totally agree with all of the lines that Ziegler has, but what I think we want to capture is that this is a moment when labor exercises almost unprecedented amounts of power and demonstrates real possibility of other directions our society might have taken. But the basis of that unity was a fragile one, and the base of the power workers were able to organize was pretty precarious. Tim, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, and just to say, I think one reason we like the kind of contradictory image of fragile juggernaut is I think, it's very common to think, okay, there was a time in the past when labor was strong, and then there's now when labor is weak.
Yeah.
And we can all see the logic to that and the reasons one might think that. But actually things aren't that simple. And even in the time, in the past, that we think of as a golden age, there were, many of the same problems, also some different problems, that we face than the ones we face today. And so I think, in a way, there's a kind of optimism for the present in pointing out the fragility of the past, which is that, these great accomplishments came out of a period when things were not easy by any stretch of the imagination.
Right.
I love that. Great way to wrap it up for sure. Really appreciate you guys and encourage folks to check out the podcast. It is definitely worth your listen.
Yeah, absolutely.
I really
Thanks for your
appreciate you
time.
both. Thanks for all the time and all the
Thank
work
you
you're
guys
doing.
so much. Great to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Y'all take care, brothers.
All
Take care.
Yeah.
Looking forward to listening to that latest episode and continuing to listen as they go on. You should too. Fragile Juggernaut, wherever you get your podcasts. You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.